Let's dive right in. Today, we're going to talk about how content modeling drives a modular customer experience. That's really the heart of what we're doing. So we'll start off by kind of talking through what is content modeling, how do we actually do it, and then walk through the process of using a content model and content modeling in the content creation process. We'll touch on some tips and tricks that we found while implementing content models. So without further ado, jump right into that crash course. So in the crash course, I'm going to both cover kind of the theoretical background of content modeling as well as how to begin building your own content models. So we're aiming for this to be kind of a helpful refresher for those of you who are already familiar with the ideas of content modeling, and hopefully a useful overview for those of you who are maybe newer to content modeling. So to start off, what do we mean when we say content modeling? Content modeling really is the work of creating formal structures that represent content types, the elements from which those content types are composed, and the relationships of those elements to each other. And before I dive into discussing content types, elements, and the relationships, I want to kind of pause and focus on the idea of structure first, and kind of have in that definition. When we talk about structure, simply put, content structure is the organization of content within a system. Content structure is the form that content takes when it's represented in, say, a database or in an XML file, in a layout tool, or any other of a number of representations of a content object. Really, structure can be described as the containers that content lives in. And humans are meaning-making creatures. We can look at content and discern structure based on the visual cues that we see. We can determine the kind of value and usefulness of information based on how it's presented to us. If we see text that's larger and bold, we know that can indicate titles and headers, which might separate sections of text. The information that's included with a set of links might indicate, oh, the links lead to an event or an article or a video. And kind of once we start looking for those elements of structure, once we start pointing them out, it's really hard not to notice them. However, that expertise can actually get in our way. We're really good at identifying those pieces, but we need systems and processes to recognize and make sense of content in the same way. And we need to provide some means for those systems and processes to comprehend content and the content structure as well. The structure that's intuitive to us needs to be made explicit to machines. So one of the drivers for content modeling is that it's no longer enough just to provide visual content structure on a printed page. We have to be able to define structure and structural relationships in a way that software and systems can understand it and actually do something with that information. Now that we're thinking kind of in terms of structure, I want to walk through how we actually understand and craft that implicit structure of our content to take that and turn it into the concrete content model. Once you start looking for implicit structure, we can begin to describe relationships among various content elements. You can see how some content elements, like I just said, headings, those suggest containers. Some elements like bullet points indicate a list. We want to take those pieces and describe them in a consistent way. And that kind of consistent description, that's what we're calling a content model. So to begin, when we are content modeling, we generally want to start at a high level and get more granular from there. So that means starting by identifying content types. And if you're familiar with the work of Carrie Hayne and Mike Atherton, how we work with content types is probably going to sound a bit familiar. So step one, how do we identify a content type? Well, content type should have a few properties. First of all, the content can stand alone in a content type. It doesn't need other information for it to make sense. One paragraph from within a long article probably won't make sense if you only read that one paragraph. One step from a series of instructions isn't very useful without all of the other steps in those instructions. On the other hand, that entire article can probably stand on its own. It doesn't need to be viewed as part of an article series in order for the content consumer to find that article useful. Also, a content type should have a consistent structure across its usage. So on our website, simplea.com, we've identified a number of content types. We've identified ones for articles and case studies, for example. So while an article and a case study, those both have titles, they both have body sections, but they're going to diverge in other structural ways. A case study might require identifying a client industry or identifying associated services, where an article won't always contain those aspects. So at first glance on a web page, those two content types might look similar, but their requirements and the purpose are different, and so they need to be modeled differently. They are separate content types. And I've mentioned some common content type names here. We have articles, case studies, podcasts, etc. It's not uncommon for organizations in the same domain to have very similar content types. If you're in a similar domain to us, you may have those same content types. However, kind of barring the use of some sort of common standard or methodology, the content types in a single industry or domain can still vary considerably. You'll probably have content types that we don't have, even if you are in the same domain. And then across different industries and domains, we can expect content types to vary even more widely. Healthcare providers will have a different set of content types than financial services, which will have a different content types than computer software. Each domain has its own needs and purposes, and the content types are really how we address and isolate that purpose of the content that we're working with. So next we have types. What do we do with types? Well, types are made up of elements. So where we just talked about types needing to be standalone, elements are the pieces of content that can't stand alone. When identifying elements, as much as possible, we want to identify the meaning behind an element rather than how the element is expressed in a particular output. I'm going to walk through a couple examples of what that actually looks like. So for example, if we see a bulleted list in a content type, instead of identifying bulleted list as your content element, think about what the meaning that bulleted list is conveying. So in a cooking recipe content type, the required ingredients might be a bulleted list of ingredients. For the recipe content type, we'd want to identify the element required ingredients, not bulleted list. Hopefully you can see how required ingredients is clearer than just stating, oh, we have a recipe and recipe contains bulleted list. Another example, in a content type for, say, an event announcement, every time you want to mention a sponsor name in maybe an introductory paragraph of the body of that content type, you might want to put the sponsor's name in bold. But instead of including a bold element in the content type, instead you want to identify an element for industry sponsor name. Bold is describing visual presentation, industry sponsor name is describing meaning. So we want the content model to be focused on the meaning associated with the content rather than any particular visual presentation. Visual presentation is really likely to change frequently, where having that kind of underlying content model increases the longevity of the content that you're working with. And one more thing on content elements, I'm not going to go in depth but I do want to note that capturing information about each element, how it should be used and constructed is important. So like how many characters are allowed in a title element? How many authors can I add to a particular content type? That's information, that information about how you write or construct the content, again, not visual design, but that information about those pieces is important to kind of capture and understand. Next, I want to talk about mappings. So throughout kind of our discussion of types and elements, I emphasized how when we're identifying types and elements, we want to look at the meaning behind those elements. That helps us put together an abstract model of the content. It means the model is not dependent on one particular presentation of content. And I'll continue to talk about why that's so important kind of later in the presentation. But for now, I just want to say that having an abstract model of content helps the content be more flexible to appear in many different possible channels. The content model is, again, is our abstract description of the makeup of a content type. However, we need some means of expressing that model. Mappings are what make that expression happen. I'm going to take a look at a visual example. So what we're seeing on the screen here is a couple screenshots of an authoring environment that we use, as well as the presentation. So this is an article, again, on the simplea.com website. You can see we've identified particular pieces. We have these fields where you can put information in, and those correspond to kind of the ideas of types and elements that I was just talking about. And we see that we're linking them to places on the actual web page itself. So what we're trying to do, we need to make the structure of content comprehensible to systems and processes. Here we have an authoring environment and kind of that HTML presentation, but that could also be processes like relational databases, markup languages like XML, or kind of really any hierarchical or relational mechanism. And keep in mind, we might be delivering to multiple channels. Here we have one channel, one authoring channel, but you could easily have many sources for your content. those kind of different sources, they need to align to ensure the consistent application and development of content. So they need to all align to that content model. So for example, you might have content in, say, data XML or in Word that needs to get imported into InDesign. The mappings that we're identifying, they create a map that indicates how to travel from the abstract model to any content input or any content output. So in the example I just gave, if we're trying to align data structure with Word and InDesign templates, we want to make the translation from one tool set to another tool set relatively painless. That's what the mappings are oriented to. And to kind of return to our definition slide here, I want to highlight one more thing, which is we'll also very likely need to identify how our content model will correspond to one or more standards. It's some of the examples we're seeing at the bottom there. For example, many of you might be familiar with schema.org. This is a website that provides schema elements that can be applied to HTML on a web page. That allows Google and other search engines to better parse the content through the application of these schema elements, and therefore it kind of increases the search engine optimization on your web page. So if we're going to have content that gets displayed on a web page, we don't just need to identify how each of the abstract models or abstract elements get represented in HTML, or how the CMS is going to generate the HTML. We need to identify how the abstract model corresponds to schema.org elements as well. And standards, by the way, can be a very important factor in mapping across domains. So standards like schema.org or DITA account for many, if not most, of the structural needs for a lot of organizations. They can help, you can take those models and build your content models based on those. And they can help in establishing consistency in content structure between various applications. And even if you're not working directly with a standard that's telling you how to model your content, it can help. Standards can still affect how you build content models. For example, if you're a healthcare organization, you need to share electronic health information. The healthcare standard HL7 is going to have some impact on how you model your content. Kind of important to keep in mind there. And kind of discussing standards really gets to the heart of one of the reasons to build content models. So content developed today, many organizations are building content for only one output. The abstract model of types and elements is the standard for content that needs to be created and mapped, and that allows us to create that connection to that standard to any process or output that we're creating. To create omnichannel customer experiences, we need to create content that's fluid, that can be expressed in more than one way. What works for one channel, it might not work for another. So the content has to be transformed from that one expression to a different expression. What we're seeing on this slide is kind of a basic example of that transformation. It's kind of, we've drawn a line around this one particular article that you're seeing in all of these different places. And that article can be previewed in many different ways. And we don't want to just redesign or kind of copy and paste that information in many different ways. Instead, we want to draw from the central content model to show all of this variation. So once we have a good sense of our model and its composition, we can really plan how it will be transformed into all of those different expressions. Okay, that was a lot of kind of theoretical information. I'm talking through those different pieces. I want to maybe get a little bit more concrete and talk about how do you actually go about creating a content model? How do you start to build it? So we'll just do a brief walkthrough on that. And we start by diagramming existing content. Well, ideally, you'd want to model content before it's being created. You want to build the abstract elements based on kind of the goals and the purpose of the content. Most often, you'll be trying to wrangle content that's already been created. So what we're seeing on this slide is kind of where we start. We're taking content that already exists. This is a white paper that Simply developed, and I'm just starting to diagram it out. This particular diagram is in Lucidchart. And what we're doing is we're kind of circling each of those content elements within the content type of the white paper, and we're giving specific names to each of those pieces. I do want to note that this part of the process, it's really flexible. We use Lucidchart, but there's any number of diagramming tools out there. Even just a simple whiteboard or pen and paper can get this process started. You're just kind of looking to identify those different pieces of the content model or of your content. So at this point, we kind of have a rough idea of content types kind of going into this diagramming process. So we already know, okay, white paper, it's probably one of our content types. And when you're doing this, you want an example of the content type that's representative of it as a whole. Don't want some example that's an edge case or kind of created under unique circumstances. Instead, we're working with, this is a typical white paper at A. That's where we want to start. Once we have created that kind of start to diagram out that abstract model, we actually want to make it concrete. And so what we're seeing here is us codifying that abstract model that we identified in the diagramming phase. So this is a Google sheet. We found that spreadsheets kind of work acceptably for this part of the process. And you can see that abstract model that we were talking about, it's under that kind of metadata and elements column. I know it might get a little small here, but you can see title and SEO description. Those are the content elements in the white paper type that we were just talking about. And then we go all the way to the right on this image, and you can see some of the mapping, one of the many mappings for articles. So I mentioned schema.org earlier. You can see we have schema.org properties that were corresponding specifically to pieces of that abstract model. So once we have that model and mappings created, that's kind of enough to start using your content model to communicate and use as part of this process. So again, spreadsheets are fine for that. However, there's more that your content model can do. But this is where we start to run into the limitations of spreadsheets. You can make some of the things I'm about to talk about next, kind of the reuse and relationships. You can make those work in spreadsheets, but it gets a little tricky. So to make this process easier, we developed an internal tool to help us identify those kind of reuse cases and other relationships in our content model. So what we're looking at right now is just a screenshot of the tool, and I'm going to just use it to talk more effectively about those particular features. To start that off, again, on the left, we have this blue text. That is our content model again. So we're looking at white paper. You can see some of the same elements we saw before. And what we're seeing here is that types and elements, they often have a more complex hierarchy than just a type contains one level of elements. Kind of think through this. If paragraphs, they might contain link elements or other pieces. Let's say you had an address element. You'd probably break that down into street and city and state elements. That in the abstract model, and we see on the right, we see some of that hierarchy. Again, this is where you can represent hierarchy in spreadsheets, but it's a little hard to do with a lot of clarity or fidelity. The other big piece that I want to talk about is identifying opportunities for content reuse across different types. So when you are creating a content model, for a number of content types, you'll probably discover that some content types will often use the same elements like title or SEO description or author. Those are often needed in many different content types. And we can take advantage of those similarities of those same elements in a couple of ways. So first, the same element can generally be expected to have many, if not all, the same mappings, regardless of content type. So instead of having to recreate all of those mappings, if you say, oh, we also need title here, instead, you just reuse the mappings that you identified for the title last time. You're kind of making all of those at the same time. You're not having to recreate them. Another key point here is identifying reusable content elements is also a way you can identify content itself that can be reused. So for example, when we were modeling content on simplea.com website, we found that our content type for webinars and our content type for short video content, they both had sections that described key takeaways from that content. So we gave both of those content types an element called key takeaways. Because the key takeaways elements has the same structure, a key takeaway section that's written for one content type could simply be reused. We don't have to recreate it or rewrite it in order to do that. This can be especially valuable for items like legal disclaimers or alerts. If you're able to reuse that content and identify everywhere that it is being reused, again, through that content model, you can set up the authoring or delivery systems to draw from one source. Instead of having to find everywhere that particular text was being reused and manually edit it, by starting with the content model, we can simply edit that content once and then set it up so that the changes propagate to everywhere that that content is being used. It's kind of a key piece of why we want that reuse capability. And so in the screenshot that we see here, the column of green text, that is identifying the source of a particular element. We can identify, okay, this is a shared element or kind of otherwise. So I want to wrap up this crash course in content modeling by returning to the goals and motivations of why we're even talking about content modeling in the first place. So the content model is the plan. That's the source of understanding about the structure that aligns everyone. That's designers and developers and authors, so on, anyone who has a stake in content, whether that is publishing to a particular channel, designing content, writing content, and so on. As the content model is kind of the incredibly robust way to develop content that can be mapped into that kind of intelligent and dynamic, fluid customer experience through that kind of content reuse and content fluidity.